that takes a look at Paul LeBlanc's recently published book, Students First. We're asking the overall question, how do Paul's insights into a higher education ecosystem where students come first apply to K-12? I asked Paul who would be on his dream team to have a meaningful conversation on this critical topic. I'm pleased to say we're all beneficiaries of the amazing group of educators and leaders that have joined in this thoughtful conversation with Paul. Before we start, I'd like to bring to your attention our upcoming Schools That Can two-day virtual forum on May 18th and the 19th. We're going to explore with our theme Beyond the Gap, what students are experiencing now, coming off of 2 years of exasperated inequities and distressing gaps that have burnt out students and educators in different ways. We'll look at where we're at as students build towards their futures and build stronger connections between the world of school and the world of work. Please join us for this further opportunity to engage with extraordinary thought leaders, educators, and students on topics that have meaning in all of our lives. At a time when we all face some of the greatest challenges we've ever experienced, providing a platform for a meaningful discourse seems to be just what's needed. So please mark your calendars. I'd now like to welcome the moderator of today's conversation, Lisa Hite-McIntyre, the Vice President of Learning Innovation, and say how delighted we are to have someone of Lisa's skills and talents leading this very important discussion. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us and moderating today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks to everyone who's taking the time to join. I echo that we're very lucky to be joined by the panel here, and I will just say it's not just a panel of thought leaders, it is a panel of thought doers, and I'm so excited to hear all of the things that are happening and the insights we can glean from this conversation. We have the bios in the chat, but I do just want to highlight that we are joined by Paul LeBlanc, President of Southern New Hampshire University and author of Students First, Equity, Access, and Opportunity in Higher Education. We have Lisa Scruggs with us, Team Lead for the Duane Morris Education Industry Group. We also have Michael Horn, an education and innovation leader who speaks and writes about the future of education. And we have Dennis Littky, co-founder and co-director of the Met School and co-founder of Big Picture Learning, and also founder and president of College Unbound. So thanks to you all for taking the time to join. As Michael mentioned, I'm your moderator, Lisa McIntyre Hite, and excited to be here and dig into our conversation. So Paul, we're gonna kick off with you since we're here because of your book. Your latest book, Students First, Equity, Access, Opportunity in Higher Education, really focuses on the promise and the potential of student-centered approaches to teaching and learning. And as you think about K-12 education and centering on students first, what opportunities do you see for practitioners and leaders in K-12 to really embrace this notion? And what does this look like to you as a leader in higher ed? Oh, Paul, you are on mute.
Yep, it's only going to take me another year of pandemic to master that. So I was starting to say thank you so much for having me and for having this conversation with such wonderful colleagues around this book. When you asked your question about the opportunities for K-12 and thinking about this, I mean, fundamentally on one level, it's exactly the same opportunity as we have in higher education, which is to move away from a one-size-fits-all industrial model of education that is really much more about moving people through and through and through, and much less about understanding individual students and all the fullness and holistic sense of them. And you know, Dennis Littky's on here, who I wrote this book in part to get ahead of him because he'd steal my ideas and do it on his own book, but also because the Met School, which he created in College Unbound, takes this philosophy and just nails it, right? Which is understanding where students are, starting with where they are, and giving them options and flexibility and frameworks for moving through. The book is really largely an argument for competency-based, outcomes-based education. So there is rigor built into that, which higher ed needs desperately and which K-12 needs desperately. And it's an alternative to what, I'm getting old enough now, I'm grumpy enough to, like Dennis, to join in and say, I really think grades are almost a sort of a moral act of power and judgment that actually aren't very much about learning, and as flawed in K-12 as they are flawed in higher ed. So I love the idea of outcomes-based learning that leads to project-based assessments that feel very relevant to students, that allow them to demonstrate mastery, that allow them to go again and again, because some of the best learning comes with our repetition and our trying. These are all, I think, opportunities. And lastly, and I'll stop, is that when we have competency-based frameworks, and I'm in New Hampshire, which was the first state in the nation to adopt a statewide framework, but others now are following as well, we start to give a common ground for higher education and K-12 to talk to each other and get better aligned. This has been a long-standing complaint about the sort of inability to connect those two, and that opens up opportunities like early college. We can have, we're playing with models now that would have students walk across the stage and in the same handshake get their high school degree and their associate's degree. Like, that's really wonderful, and we can unleash students in a way that I think our one-size-fits-all model today does not, and does not in the end put students first, but often puts system needs, efficiency, budgets, and a whole bunch of other things that are really important, but aren't really about learning or aren't really about students.
Paul, you mentioned how the book talks a lot about, competency-based education and outcomes-based approach. And you also gave a nod to Dennis and some of his work. I do appreciate, on behalf of Michael and the other Lisa, that you didn't lump us in as old. But Dennis, in terms of the Met School and the work that you're doing there, would love to hear how that works at Met School in terms of like individualized attention that Paul alluded to, flexibility and timing, and the kind of promising practices that you've seen, particularly maybe in light of the pandemic, where schools are really doing this work of putting students first. What does this look like?
Well, it's, when you say put students first, it's hard for me to understand people not saying that all the time. What are we doing? And I wear my best t-shirt here from Big Picture, one student at a time. So if you have a student sitting in front of you, it's about that student. It's not about the whole class. And we do special plans for special learning plans for special ed kids or the gifted. Every kid in our school has their own individual learning plan, okay? Our goals aren't these real little goals that learn this fact, this fact, this fact, that are brought on by some of the college pressure on the schools, but they're the broad skills, like the problem solving, like reflection, like collaboration. And kids have to show this through their work. So science isn't just earth science. Our goal is kids have to think like a scientist. So one kid's working at the zoo, because we all have internships from 9th grade on. That's his science. Mm-hmm. Another girl is working in the hospital doing research. We're trying to get them to think like a scientist. And that's why we really went on to start the college, because those are the same goals for the college. And they're the broad college. Are you resilient? Are you creative? Can you solve problems? And can you show this through an exhibition? So I think the mantra, one student at a time, just makes sense. And, the gang of 11 that decided there's biology, chemistry, whatever, I just somehow think if it was John Dewey's group and he was talking about lifelong learning, then those would be our goals. So we have to change our mindset to do it. We have one teacher who follows the kids for 4 years, works with the family. So it's easy to set up a structure if your mindset's there. And yes, those are all my shoes. It's my wallpaper in my office, in case you're wondering.
Dennis, thank you for that. I wonder, can we just click a layer deeper? Because you did say like it can be easy, but I think for those of us who are very used to like a very traditional model and traditional policies, even, it doesn't always feel easy. And so Lisa, as we think about your work, I'm just curious, like as we move towards mastery-based, proficiency-based, incorporating some of these things, Dennis, that you mentioned too, and the kind of reform that's needed, like what challenges and opportunities, Lisa, do you see from the policy side? And also like Dennis, I would love to hear after we hear from Lisa, like how did you bridge that gap and what did that look like for you both?
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. So excited to be part of this conversation. And it's just listening to Paul, listening to Dennis talk about how to put these ideas in action is super exciting. And I spend a good deal of my time working with folks like Dennis, like Paul, who have incredible ideas about how to put students first, how to innovate. I have a lot of clients in our in our work who are focused on trying to deliver instruction in new ways, right? Unbound, trying to focus on competency-based or more personalized learning models. And one of the things that I found is that I'm coming to it often with a policy making or a lawmaking perspective, right? Legal perspective. People are coming to me, they are excited, they are ready to go. They are either already doing it or they're trying to make sure that they can get it done in terms of an innovative way of focusing on instruction and serving children. And they want to know, is it legal? Are there legal barriers? Are there policy barriers to my accomplishing this? And then oftentimes after that, when they are successful, like so many of the ideas that, again, Paul and Dennis talk about, then they want to know, how do I scale it, right? And so the question really becomes, how do you take these entrepreneurial ideas and how do you put them in place? How do you remove barriers? That's what it often looks like, is because we have our laws lag behind innovation frequently, right? You always have policy following innovation. So how do you remove those barriers to ensure that the innovators are actually able to do what they need to do, that they're not disrupted by regulators coming in and imposing layers of administrative burden or unnecessary burden, kind of related to accountability, related to other concerns about how do you fund these things? How do you do that? So I see that as frankly one of the bigger challenges, because as entrepreneurs, frequently innovators are focused almost exclusively on the students and families that they are serving and the communities in which they are working. And so what that means is, by any means necessary. From a policy perspective, what that means is they call me and they're saying, I've got this really cool model. It has nothing to do with seat time. It has nothing to do with days and hours of a student being in a particular building, being observed and coached or instructed by a particular person. It's unbound in a lot of ways. How do I get this done? In many states, what that looks like is seeking waivers. It means appealing specifically to a particular regulator and trying to get an exception so that you can move forward. On the rare occasion, it may mean a pilot program if you can get that far, right? But what I've found is in serving clients, people who are innovating in the space, what I think we would like to see, and it's a real opportunity, frankly, is to see innovators talking to one another. Because for policy purposes, what you need is you either need a kind of a groundswell of need, right, to bring about change. You need some level of consensus that there is a need for a policy change so that you can remove barriers to innovation. Or you need kind of proven models. And oftentimes one instance is not enough. And so if we could, figure out, I think there is a real opportunity for innovators to share and to step outside of, I've gotten this solution done for my students and my community. If they can move beyond that, I think we have a real opportunity to get ahead of it so that hopefully innovation is leading, not just in practice, but also in policy.
Lisa, thank you so much for that. And, we're joined by everyone on this panel who's actually had led innovation work. And so just to open up, Dennis, to hear a little bit more about what that looks like, but also just how do we reconcile this policy follows innovation? So there's a need to innovate, but there's also this barrier. And what does that look like? And advice and insights you might have for those who have joined in terms of how to navigate that space.
Yeah. Michael Horn, you want to go before me? I've talked already.
I'm happy to hear you, Dennis, and then I'll jump in with the Clay Christensen take. How about that?
It is interesting. And part of it is the entrepreneurs just got to be bold. I remember when we started the Met, we talked about waivers that nobody uses. And the person from the Department of Ed brought a book about that big and said, here, tell us what waivers you need. And Elliot and I gave it back and said, tell me which ones we can't use. And that was the end. So we just kept doing things. But let me give you a couple examples, because all our work, Lisa, you talked about scale. We started with a Met with 50 kids. We now have 150 schools around the world and over 20,000 students. So how'd that happen? And And in each state, there's something in the way. So California, our kids couldn't get into the UC system because they have something called A to G. You have to take these exact courses. So we spent about 2 years matching our portfolio work and our competency work with their A to G. We finally got it approved, and that opened up for everybody. So it's kind of cool that it went from the ground up, you know, and it's kind of not great that we had to spend that time. On the other hand, I live in Rhode Island, and they made a policy that no daycare centers could be in a basement. And that made sense, except the top 2 daycare centers were in a basement. So they didn't look at, you know, they were up here, okay? The other thing that we're doing, and that's exciting, is all through the other countries, taking a test at the end is the most important thing. And our group in Australia, where we have many, many schools and big picture Australia, has developed a competency-based graduation piece that colleges, the biggest colleges in Australia, have accepted that instead of the exam. That's big time if that continues to work. And we can, you know, we're playing with testing it in the state of Washington. So, I mean, I was listening to Lisa, and I don't know, you know, it's a shame. You got to do it, and 3 years later, it's got to be okayed. On the other hand, the people closest to what's going on are the ones to know what policy. The last thing I'll say, I remember California made this fantastic policy. All kindergarten classes were going to be 10 kids smaller. They forgot to look if they had enough classrooms, and they didn't. So I think it's got to be that combination. So.
Just to point off that, just to jump off where Dennis is, if it's okay, is that I think, you know, what you just heard in Dennis's comments about where the innovation worked when it went from the bottoms up is that as the entrepreneur, you didn't just think about my narrow piece of this. You thought about then how does it scale into something bigger and more system wide? So the Australia example, I think, is a great one, because a lot of times you'll see an entrepreneur you know, say, look, the seat time based system, all these requirements and so forth doesn't work for me, but they don't want to put forth an alternative outcomes based framework that's going to have some validity and reliability, and the universities are going to buy into, that then others can build off of that framework, right, to scale the innovation. And a lot of times, I think the way it sounds from a policymaker perspective, having been in a lot of these hearings around the country, is you're just trying to shirk and sort of make excuses for those kids and get around everything. And that's not my experience on the ground with the innovators and the entrepreneurs, but I do think it's not enough just to say, free us from this stuff. You got to put forth an alternative framework that's more robust, because, and just to make this point, I mean, one of the biggest things holding us back right now is the current system of accountability in the US and K-12. The assessment system is an autopsy. You know, it's the opposite of what Dennis said of one student at a time. It literally looks at the mass of students and says, what percent didn't pass? And so, you know, it's literally looking at the average and doing the opposite of this. Well, it's not enough just to say that doesn't work for me. We got to put forth something that is actually looking at each individual and saying, actually, mastery-based or competency-based learning is more rigorous, because we're going to guarantee that each student meets these abilities to not just know stuff, to Dennis's point, but do something useful with them and build things that are of value in the community. Yeah.
I think that's the example. What you're saying, Michael, is that the entrepreneurs on the ground got to work closer with policymakers. Okay. Because if you're too busy on the ground, you might have the idea, and the policymakers can make it happen. So, and it's, you know, Lisa, you'll probably say this, it's about timing. One of the things that helped us in the A to G in California, homeschooling was starting to take off, and they didn't know what to do with it. And that by okaying us, it opened up every homeschooler now could present their work. So it was the right time.
As we're thinking about innovation, Paul, I'm thinking back to your book, and even though it's the higher ed piece, you talk a lot about like a demonstration project, what that could look like in higher ed. And I think there's some lessons learned here for, in relation to this conversation. Could you share some insights around the demonstration project and some ideas there that might be applicable in K-12 as well as higher ed?
Yeah, and generally speaking, I mean, I think we know this, right? That good policy follows practice. And the impulse of many policymakers is to prescribe, and they get preoccupied with preventing bad agents, which is important, like we saw the abuses in higher ed, but it's very hard to do that from a prescriptive anticipation. There's still, in higher education, there's still regulatory language around things like microfiche. It's like, really, we're talking about microfiche? So, but it lingers, right? So what I've argued for a long time is that we need, so we're in a regulated industry. It doesn't get disrupted overnight in the same way that journalism or music did, right? We're a third-party payer. It's just going to evolve more slowly, but the regulators need to create more safe spaces for innovation and for trying things. And they have those available to them quite often. As Dennis said, there's a book of waivers, like, I want all of them. Like, give me this, that space for me to play in. That's regulatory space for me to play in. So the Department of Ed has something called experimental sites. It was really designed to find ways to tweak Title IV regulations and disbursement, but the Obama administration used it pretty widely. Like, they used that regulatory breathing space to try a bunch of new things. There's something else called a demonstration project, and this actually comes out of Congress. And Congress can say, we're really interested in learning how this new thing, fill in the blank, works. We're going to sort of create a sandbox. It will have guardrails around it, but schools can apply to be in that sandbox and try stuff. And from that, we will be able to write better policy. And the best example of this, I described in the book, was the 50% rule in higher education. There was a longstanding rule that said 50%, half of your education, always had to be on site, in place. And of course, that was a problem if you're trying to think about serving adults at a distance who wouldn't be able to come to a site. So they did a demonstration project in the 90s, which waived that rule. And you could say, I'm going to go 75% online or more. And a number of schools, I was at one of them, said, we're going 100%. We're going to do 100% first fully virtual degrees. And that opened up the knowledge. And at the next reauthorization of higher education, the rule was lifted, and now you could do online education. And look, there were abuses of that rule when it was lifted, but only because not-for-profit higher ed looked down their nose at it and they ceded the territory. And as you know, many for-profits rushed in. Some of them are good players, they're still around today, and there were a lot of bad players. But now we've seen that shift, the pendulum swung, right? We're all sort of doing online education. We need more safe sandboxes for entrepreneurs and experimenters and innovators to play in. Yeah. And to Dennis's point, you start to close a tighter loop between policymakers and the innovators.
Yeah, and one thing I also want to say, and Lisa, you'll probably think about this, it's not only timing, but it's the right people. So Paul got competency-based past an accrediting agency. I couldn't have gotten that. He got that because of his reputation, and it opened up for all of us. So we have to be smart. Who's got the cachet or the connection? Paul worked at the Department of Ed for a few months or a year, I don't know, Paul, but and was able to change stuff there and then go back and do his job. So I think not only connecting entrepreneurs with the policy people, but finding the people with the cachet that can get that done for the rest of us.
I do think on that front, Paul raises an important point that we might think more about in the K-12 sphere as well, which is what are the appropriate guardrails and how do we construct policy around that? And I think rather than, Paul described the impulse to prescribe everything and control all the inputs and so forth that a lot of policymakers have. I think in some ways, thinking about limits on scale until we figure out how do we appropriately make sure that the incentives are for student outcomes might be a better measure so that we don't have some of the higher ed abuses where it just gets so many students so fast that we start saying, whoa, that's not what we meant. And it's actually a big struggle to bring the genie back into the proverbial bottle. K-12, interestingly enough, and Lisa Scruggs, you probably have more insight on this than any of us, but K-12, interestingly enough, might work better in that way than higher ed because it is really much more of at the state level than higher ed, which is really much more at the federal level for some of these ideas.
Yeah, I think you guys are hitting on, a number of really key points about how do you do this in K-12. I think, the piece that we touched on earlier, and my dog is weighing in as well.
I'm glad it's your dog interfering.
It's
with
my
you.
dog this time. But one of the things I just wanted to also, highlight again is and it does, I think, help this point about the timing as well as the people. What that kind of requires is communication and for people to get together and to share, and a willingness to share, right? I think one of the challenges is you're moving at such a quick pace. There's such difficult work and time-consuming work to get ideas off the ground. And so the idea of sharing or going into, a session with others where the primary focus is just sharing out and trying to identify what are the barriers to, putting in place something that's sustainable. What are the staffing model changes, right? I think there's a lot of focus, and as we think about these new ways to innovate, we focus on human resources and capital and understanding what works, what doesn't work. So not just the who, not just the timing, but also how do we ensure that the lines of communication are open? How can we create forum for innovators to get together again? And so that there are also kind of recorders in the room, folks like Paul, who had the access and the link to policymakers to make sure that they're also informed when those conversations are happening. So you need kind of the folks who are really able to identify, what are the common threads, what are some of these common issues, so that those things can be brought to the table, to the policy table.
And here's a word to any foundations who are listening. Sometimes it works the opposite. You put us all in the room, and everyone knows that only half the people are getting the money next year. And so people become competitive rather than doing what Lisa said. So I think that's very important. And it's my word to funders today, to foundations.
There's a lot of good action in the chat around just the policy question, the practice question, some good examples of innovation and pilots that are happening in the K-12 space. One question that actually comes from our audience here that I think is timely, so just we'll chime in here. We talked a lot about policy, practice, communication, but what's the role of research in this, and how does that fit in from your perspective? So whoever wants to take that one, just jump in. Just what's the role of research in all of this?
I'll go last.
Critically important. I think, we all want as practitioners insight into what's really making a difference, what's getting in our way still, what works best for students. I know that in our work around CBE, we had a research team that was constantly, testing and asking questions and monitoring and getting insight so we could do iterations. And it's also so critical, if you're innovating, to be able to bring that to bear as evidence and to make the case and build support. Particularly with regulators. So it plays a critical role.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think research, there's different dimensions of it, right? There's research that is informing practice. And the big thing I would say is, unfortunately, researchers often fall back on best practices as opposed to what's the right practice for your circumstance. And so, getting out of these studies of technology on average hurts student learning. It helps no one. And we can each find plenty of examples that show the exact opposite. So that nuance, I think, of practice is really important. Being on the ground and really helping inform it is one set of research that I think is helpful. A second one is around these policy questions that we're talking about. How do you set up the right sets of incentives that make sure we're not creating incentives to leave students behind or be inequitable as we design these systems, but also gives enough room for the entrepreneurs to do right by the students. I think that's an important second one. And then the third piece, I'll just put a plug in for. Our state of assessments is woefully behind where we need it to be in any shape or form. We need to have way more diversity of ways to prove mastery on any set of competencies. The performance-based tasks that Dennis was referring to should be a much bigger part of this. But I think, doing so in a way that is valid and reliable and gives people confidence, I think is important. And I don't think we've done nearly enough investing of dollars or research into supporting that sort of innovation.
Yeah, no, Michael, when I was at the department, Ted Mitchell was the undersecretary of it at the time, and Arnie was the secretary, and they asked me to see if I could put together a little primer, if you would, for the department staff on assessment. So we brought in AIR, highly respected. And so it was a nice piece of pro bono work. Like I begged them, could you just come in and talk to the staff for a couple of hours about just a white paper in the state of assessment? And this is not their words, but essentially amounted to somewhere between dismal and abysmal. It's sort of, right, if you take a look at, again, the science of assessment, and then again, and they weren't even talking about the ways in which we misuse assessment, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with what you guys just said in terms of we need to assess programs, we need to assess what Paul talked about. But one of the things that your past partner, Clay Christian, used to say, a lot of evaluation of new things is built from evaluations that are for old things. So you can't evaluate something new by an old standard, and that's what we do. The other piece that saddens me is we know how to do this. We really do. I happen to be trained as a psychologist. We know how kids learn. We know they don't learn in a classroom. We know seat time doesn't work. We know all that, but we still do it. So that's the frustrating part for me when people are asking questions, and we do know we've had, 100 years of research how people learn. So that's why it's like caught in between for me.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Dennis. I guess my only push is I don't think, though, that just because we know that we guarantee then the people who step outside that will take what we know and put it into practice. And that's why deeper set of systems of assessments. And I say systems of assessments because I want a plurality of ways, right, to do this, not a one size fits all. And I think that's where, we need for a given learning competency, right, a given goal, to be able to think critically about X domain and do some sort of, performance task in it. We need to think of a way of how do I assess whether someone has in fact met that standard or not, that gives enough diversity, right, to what that performance can be. And I don't think we've done nearly enough work in that domain. And to your point, it's new, right? We've never done anything like it. But I do think that the standards or what some of the goals, there is a little more durability and consistency than sometimes we let on that on that part of it.
I guess, go on, Lisa.
No, I was just going to say, just building on that, I think, building on this idea that we really need to see a shift in focus and thinking around how we assess. What that means is we need some investment and frankly, some more innovation around research, right? How we conduct research. We need, so to really figure out how do we create incentives at that level of education where we are teaching researchers how to research, what questions to answer, how do we right size what we look at with the tools we use to evaluate what we look at, right? And what we value. I think there's another piece, frankly, that we have to do, and there has to be some investment around advocating and for the validity of these alternative ways of looking at what works and what we need our students to be able to do and to be able to exhibit that they know how to do. So that means some investment in innovation at the research level. And just a tip of my hat also to someone, I think in the chat, who raised a question around what are we doing at our teacher education institutions. That is another big place where we've got to see some innovation. We've got to be able to break through, because without that, right, we're not going to have the human capital to get what we need done.
But I think there's one thing to add, like you're 100% right about the people doing the work and the researchers. But what you were talking about, Michael, and he said never gets together. So is there a whole other role for people? And that's what happens to teach. You hear people in teacher training colleges say, this is not how you're supposed to teach, but this is how I'm doing it. So somehow we need people in the middle to do the translation or make it a responsibility of people doing the research.
Would you? I think the other thing, if I can just keep adding on to this excellent part of the discussion, I also think we should name what I would argue is at work here, which is that in a society which is increasingly inequitable, public schools are actually doing what they're designed to do. Dennis. So when you say no, they're not really, we know how children learn. It's like system's not designed for that. System, public schools with the wealth inequity and the sort of, privileged schools, they look exactly like what we're talking about. They're great. I just toured a day school, private day school that my daughters attended. We were lucky, they were lucky enough to attend. And I've looked at the way that they're doing so much of what we're talking about today. If I drive a half a mile away to the local public school, it doesn't look anything like that. What's the difference? The unwillingness of taxpayers to make the kind of investments that Lisa's talking about. And really, I think this is a sort of a failure of sort of late capitalism. And we have who said, the system gives you exactly the kind of outcomes that you designed it to give you. And that's really, for me, an indictment of where we are as a society right now.
Yeah, it's very sad. Many years ago, whoever was head of education in New York went through, and any school that had low test scores had to do this particular curriculum. If you were a richer school and had higher test scores, you could do what you want. It seemed backwards. Why don't you take what they're doing and let other people do it? So kind of cuckoo.
And I think
I don't disagree with that. I also think, we have the theory of action often reversed in this country, in the sense that, the students coming from the least need the most, right? And so, we think of boarding schools or the most supports for those with the most. It's the exact opposite in my experience. And I actually think that, we should be taking certainly more from the examples you both just gave of places serving well-off students. But I also think we have to be careful, because some of those students in other schools are coming from places where they're not getting books, right, in their home environment. They're not getting background knowledge that my kids are getting. And so therefore, like if my kid's school skates over some fundamental coherent knowledge sequence, not a big deal. They'll get it from me. But, some of these kids aren't getting that in the early years. And so I think we both have to take, but also balance out some of these elements.
Yeah. When I'm referring to that, I'm really referring more to the pedagogy,
Yeah, I agree with you. And obviously I agree with you there.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, the reductivist, right, notion, the study just came out in Tennessee. Some of you may have seen that preschools actually were worse for the kids who attended them. Like it resulted in worse outcomes than kids that didn't. And, you looked at the preschools, well, they're drill and kill, absence of play sort of places. So.
Yeah.
I think this even gets back to in the chat, there was a question around teacher prep, and I'll just say I was a high school English teacher and a principal. And when I was a good high school English teacher, they said, you don't have to work with any of the at-risk, poorly behaved kids anymore. We're going to have you work with the honors kids now. Yeah. And then the new teacher can go and work with the kids who need the most support. And I remember saying, the kids up here will be fine. Go send them to wherever you want. Like keep the good teachers with the students who need. That's exactly what is on your shirt, like a commitment to one student at a time. And that takes a lot of training and preparation to be able to do that. And I think, as we're shifting into just thinking about like transformation in schools, I do, Paul, in your book, you talk about student learning and how oftentimes, like when we measure student learning, what we're actually measuring is our learning model and our teaching efficacy. And we see that so often. And, starting to think about like, how do we actually begin this shift and truly engage in like the real work that needs to happen to assess ourselves as educators, as educational institutions, as agents of change. How do we do this work to actually create this change for learners? And so, Michael, I do want to start with you with this to kick us off there and continue this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how do we start to flip this around?
Right. Yeah.
I start with where Paul started a few minutes ago, which is the system does exactly what it was designed to do. And Clay Christensen taught us that every organization has resources, processes, priorities, or the revenue formula in essence. And you run that lap around once and it gets very quickly locked, and it tells you the capabilities of an organization, but also what it's not capable of doing. And From my standpoint, that's why entrepreneurs are so important, but it can't be entrepreneurs that are asked to plug back in to the existing system. They need to plug into a whole new value network that values the work very differently and focuses on the growth of each individual child. Growth of each individual child is really important in that statement, because again, the current system is built around what percent of students did not make it. It doesn't tell you what they missed. It doesn't tell you what to do. I actually think what we're talking about is a more accountable system. It's a more transparent system than the current mode of accountability. I do think we need to change the rhetoric a little bit around that, saying, hey, that was great what you did 20 years ago. We want to take the next 3 steps and actually care about each individual, just so that we change the framing to try to bring people along as opposed to attack. The other piece I would just say is, in terms of the pedagogy and so forth, I do think like educators, they don't know certain things. I agree, they're not taught, but some of these things are, to Dennis's point before. If we can free up the inputs and focus on the growth of each individual child, I think the educators will start tweaking and moving toward that more and more. And by the way, the schools of education then will start studying it, because fundamentally schools of education, like a lot of them are research-based institutions. They study the present system. Why haven't they studied, things like what Dennis is doing or what Montessori education is doing or some of these other models out there? It's not where, there's not a lot of them out there for them to make their careers and publish out of. So if we create more opportunities, I think we can start to change that cycle over time.
Yeah. And I think everyone's right in saying schools are doing what they're supposed to do, and they separate people. Somebody asked me once, if you could do one thing? And since I'm an old person, I remember back in the 50s, and when there weren't so many private schools. And so you had the rich going to public schools. Thus, they cared about public schools. Now they leave the public schools, and that's a big difference because they don't care about it. So, and the other thing, just to follow Michael, I think it's an architectural term, form follows function. So, when we changed our schools, Elliot and I really closed our eyes and said, what should school be if we didn't know it? Okay. If we didn't know it was, we're not trying to put math and science together. We're really starting from scratch. And if you do that, then your staffing changes. You don't have assistant principals. You don't have chair people. You get everyone down on the ground. So even though our ratio is no different than any high school, 1 to 25, our classrooms, most high schools, classrooms are 25, but their ratio in their school is 1 to 16 because they have the librarian, they have the assistant principals, so how do you decide what you want and then change that structure? So
I just wanted to make one additional observation here, and it's something that we talk about, but I feel like there's not enough focus on, and that is parent involvement. And I think we do have a real opportunity in this point in time when we're coming off of a period where so many parents had an unprecedented window into how their students learn and how they were being taught, and a growing desire to understand at an individual school level, right? So often, I think prior to the pandemic, a lot of focus on school level performance, community level performance, district level performance in K-12. And now parents got a chance to say, is my student learning? How does my individual student grow? And that's an opportunity potentially for us to move this conversation. If we can figure out how to bring parents along, I think they can be a really powerful force for trying to get us to move this conversation and to actually effectuate some of the changes we're talking about.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dennis.
No, I was going to say, in our schools, the parents got to come in every 8 weeks in order to watch a kid's exhibition. They can't get a report card, which is really more of a description of their work if they don't come in. And people told me that would never work. People got jobs. We pulled it off. So they're actually, what you're saying, Lisa, they're there. They can see, is my kid learning? Is my kid not learning? Et cetera, et cetera. And at some time, Lisa, I'd like to, because this connects, to talk about why I think we were successful during the pandemic and why other people were not. But Michael, you had something?
I was just going to say on this parent point, I think actually mastery-based learning is an important ingredient in getting parent buy-in. And it's for two reasons, I think. One, moving to mastery-based learning moves past our zero-sum education system that assumes that for every winner, there's a loser. So it stops pitting my kid against your kid, assuming that, you know, it's a norm reference as opposed to did we meet the learning goals, right? And it stops this notion that we are hoarding scarce seats or opportunity at every point along the junction, and this sorting system that we've all talked about. The second thing I think it does that's really powerful is there's a good deal of research about the adversarial relationship often between teachers in K-12 schools and parents, because the teacher is put up in the position of not just being the supporter and teacher and advocate, but also the final judge and jury. They're grading the kid, and it creates this tension and adversarial relationship. And, you know, I think Western Governors University in higher ed, Paul, I'll be curious if you agree, does the best job of separating out the faculty role, unbundling and saying, hey, these are our assessment professionals. And they're going to say, did this project you just did, you know, this performance in nursing or whatever it is, did this reach mastery? And if I'm upset about that, I can't say it's because my teacher hated me, because the person grading me doesn't know me, right? I think this works your way, and Dennis, in your schools as well, where the community and experts are really judging these performances in many cases to saying, is this mastery? And that fundamentally changes the relationship if I don't have to be the grader, the final judge of the student, because then I can be fully in with you and the parent saying, I'm here for that child just to make sure that I get them to mastery.
Yeah, I disagree. Finally, we were looking for something to disagree, because I don't think, although everything you said makes sense, learning ain't that simple. And so it is a personal thing. So I look at our teachers, advisors, faculty as coaches, that they think they're in it together. Rather than the blame, it's just looking at the positive way, and they know the people and they understand. I mean, there's certain skills that are clear. You have it or you don't have it, but so much of learning is much more personal.
I actually think we're saying the same thing, Dennis.
Okay, damn, I wanted to.
Yeah, no, sorry. Just because my point is that the current system doesn't allow for that to happen. Whereas if we move to a mastery-based system with a positive sum, then the teachers and the teams, they're all working together to get you to master. And they're not the culprit of saying like, sorry, you didn't get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's great. It's great. We are getting very close to time, but Paul, I don't want to cut you off. Paul LeBlanc, go ahead.
No, I mean, you know, ditto to everything that's been said thus far. And if I could sort of pull the aperture out a little bit more, a little bit further and talk about something, and I spent the last year really trying to get at this question about how do large scale systems, because the problems and challenges are large scale. So how do large scale systems so often come to dehumanize the very people they're meant to serve? And I think that happens in higher ed all the time, and it certainly happens in K-12. And I spent a lot of time looking at other industry sectors and interviewing people who are really thinking about what they do in new ways. And this included healthcare, K-12, and criminal justice, substance abuse treatment, et cetera. I think the things that sort of, you know, what are the themes that come up? And I pose these perhaps as a test of any new system or any new solution that we devise is, in the end, do the kids feel like they matter? Do they come to school feeling like they matter to someone, right? The second one is, are we setting up schools that lift their sights, that allow them to dream bigger dreams than their context, their communities, or their situation perhaps allows them? Or if they have those dreams, do we help them sort of fully understand those dreams and the pathways to realizing them? And then I think the third, and I was really sort of struck by, I'm sure you know it, but Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. Large scale systems want to segment people, and they want a single story. And we need to understand people and their multiple stories. If we're going to really do the kind of work that Dennis and Michael and Lisa were all describing. We can't lift people up if we don't actually know them in the holistic sense that I think the med school does so well. And the problem that I've seen, and all of these innovators in these other sectors are solving for, is that systems want to steal human time away. You can't shortchange it. Like there's no shortchanging the coaching that Dennis just alluded to. There's no shortchanging the kind of time, which is a kind of love that's required, I think, in teaching, that I think Michael points to. So we don't put grades on the people we love. Like there's no point in our relationship where Michael looks at Tracy and says, I kind of got a C this week. Just want to say, like, that's not going to a good place, right? So I do think Michael is spot on, and assessment sort of breaks that, right? And so wholly agree. And what I've seen is for real system reformers and things like, I'll just use one example, Iora Health. I think it has a new name, it was just acquired, but Iora Health is a new, pretty scaled healthcare system. And they've done some remarkable things, all built around healthcare coaches. So they've actually reduced the amount of time people get to spend with medical staff. You don't actually need a lot of time with medical staff, but you need to spend a lot of time with someone who actually knows you. So when that doctor says, hey, Dennis, you got to have less salt in your diet, and he really does. When the doctor says that to him, it's the healthcare coach when the doctor leaves the room and says, all right, Dennis, let's talk about this. Like, what's that? What are you hearing? And Dennis like, I don't know, I'm going to eat less salty food. It's like, let's go a little deeper than that. Let's look at the grocery list. Oh, my niece gets my groceries. Do you tell her what to buy? And they sort of walk through this, like, let's get your niece on the phone. That takes time. You can't sort of make efficient systems for that. But what they do, and I'll stop here, and I think they're really interesting models, like co-ops are an interesting system model, is that you build broad scale infrastructure and technology that gets all of the busy work, all of the sort of stuff that is a distraction from the direct work of relationships with students or the people you serve out of the system. So on average, teachers spend 12 hours a week in public schools looking for content. What the hell? Like that ought not to be a new adventure for every new teacher, right? So let's standardize what we need to in order to give all of that non-standardized time that a teacher needs when they're sitting face to face with one kid. And I think everyone I talked to in this book that will be out next August, they're all figuring out ways to scale time in a way that we just don't talk about. We look at Amazon and think, look at the massive scale with technology and systems. Like they're selling books, they're selling goods. As Dennis said, this is hard, messy stuff of human nature, and it's high stakes work. So my little preachiness, I'll stop.
Yeah, Lisa, I would just like to say, I'm sorry, were you talking?
Go ahead.
During the pandemic, because this is the bottom of everything we're saying, people are looking all at this as a deficit. We're all looking at this as what can we do as an asset? And so I am tired of reading that someone couldn't get to the end of the textbook or couldn't do this. And by having the one student at a time, you had students, I have students now that talk every day to other students in Kazakhstan. They wouldn't do that before. They learn about that culture. I have a student just transferred to our school, wanted to be an artist. She visits another museum every day online and is taking art courses. So rather than saying you got to do X, Y, and Z, it's what's important now. Somebody had a death in their family through COVID. So the kid couldn't understand it. So then went studying death, and that's how we get the science, the whatever in. But so it's much more of an asset, how we think, here's the situation, whatever it is, and how do we do better? So sorry, I just had to, it's important to me.
Oh, that's great. Please, no apologies. It was all good and inspiring stuff. I know we're coming up on time here, and I do want to just acknowledge, like, and Paul, you started to share this, like, the widespread adoption and scale of mastery-based approaches, the kind of assessments we're talking, the kind of transformation that we're talking about demands more of everyone, schools, teachers, policymakers, our learners even as well. And when we think about all the people in the room, they're here because they want to engage in this kind of work and they're passionate about improving outcomes for our learners. So I would like to end just by doing a quick round robin with each of you, asking, what is the most important thing, the most important piece of advice that you would give to help the people on this call as they continue to promote students first in K-12? And so Lisa, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think the mantra of putting students first and having that question be the core of your efforts, and even in the policy realm. So often, again, the focus can be when you're trying to scale, when you're trying to figure out what the policy barriers or policy incentives might be, you're thinking more broadly. You're thinking about administrative burden. You're thinking about efficiency. You're not thinking about what directly needs to happen for an individual child. And I think, even though, again, it takes time, it takes lots of resources to look at problems in that way. But I encourage people to continue to try to do it, because I think that's where you get, sustainable change when you're actually focused on individual children.
That's great. Dennis, you want to go next?
Yeah, well, I happened to talk to one of Paul's classes at Southern New Hampshire last Saturday of experienced teachers, and they get themselves in a box. I used to many years ago train student teachers. They were all excited. They had the philosophy right. When I visit them 3 years later, they look like every other teacher. So my word to all these teachers who were going for their master's degree was to be true to why you entered the profession, and to be bold and to say, are you really teaching what you care about? Do you care that your 30-year-old daughter, what she had in her SAT? No, you care about her moral courage. You care. So I tried to push people to be more honest with themselves. And the other system piece is, I've been very fortunate for both College Unbound, the Met School. They started from scratch. Okay. Now I've also been director of schools that didn't start from scratch. But how does the system allow more people? So it's not outside the system, and you don't have these charter school fights with the public school, but how do colleges allow more experimentation? Public schools allow more experimentation as examples. So
That's great. That's great. Michael.
Yeah, I'd say be wary of preaching or politicking or prosecuting people for not being on the same page as you, and instead focus on how you can help them to ask questions. Because when you ask questions, that creates the space for solutions. And by the way, it's a great way to engage students as well.
Yeah. One of the things we did with when we were going in schools who thought they were very good, we brought back their kids who had graduated and were off at college. And they talked about what they didn't get and what was important. And so it's like Michael said, we didn't have to preach anything. They saw what they did. So,
Right. Paul, we'll wrap with you and your advice and insights for the attendees.
Paul's going to wrap. Fantastic.
I think we've talked a lot about regulatory environments. We've talked a lot about systems. We've talked a lot about the ways the sort of large entities, higher ed, employers, all sort of interact in this. But I think for leaders who are thinking about the kinds of schools they want to build, this kind of schools they want to lead, we have to talk about the people that you bring to the task, right? And what are the qualities we need in leadership, and what are the qualities we need in the teams that we build and then lead. And I think we are in a world where, in the last 2 years, the world has changed dramatically, as we all know. Student behaviors have changed dramatically, good and bad. And our employee behaviors have changed. And we're still trying to sort that out, all of us, anyone who's paying attention. So I would suggest to you, and I sort of, after all the sort of research and talking to all of these people who are leading change, the things that came up again and again for the way they think about their own leadership and the people they want to hire is they want to hire people who ask more questions and who collect more stories, right? We need to be curious. The thing that's dangerous in a time like this is certainty. You can be clear about the mission, right? To lift people up, to make kids help kids realize their potential. But you have to be, I think, very uncertain about how we operate now. You need to be curious and learning. So we need learning organizations, I think, to develop leaders who are more empathetic than expert. In every case where I've hired someone to lead work for us, and they're like, God, they're so damn good. And someone says, yeah, but their emotional intelligence is not great. And we rationalize and say, we'll work with them, or we'll make sure that they got somebody on their team who's got better human skills. It never works, right? It never works. So hire people who actually understand how to be with human beings, And then I think it's really at the end of something I sort of touched on earlier, is to build systems that make sure you're not shortchanging time. And I know, like, with the size of SNHU today, I am convinced that we are now asking people to spend more and more of their time making the system happy than actually with students. And I'm driving my people crazy saying, I want to understand our functional work, where it's happening, and how much of this is because we have to keep the system happy, regulators happy, our internal processes happy, our risk compliance people happy. And none of it has to do with the students sitting in front of us. And I think that, we have to be sort of rigorous and relentless about that. And it's Dennis's earlier point, right? He had a great example. You look at school ratios and then sort of see where people are. They're satisfying the system. The system becomes more important than the kids in it.
Absolutely.
And we have to not just do it, but we got to keep thinking, I can't get this, to do it just.
Do it just.
There we go.
Put your shoes back on, Dennis.
Dennis, Michael, Lisa, thank you so much. Paul, thank you for putting pen to paper in your book and really outlining the case for students first. Much appreciated. And thanks to all of the attendees who joined us today. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Do it just.